Okay, January 1860, and first decade in the bag. First of, 70 in total, and the first video was released on 1st of January this year. So 4.5 months in. It gives you an idea, really, as to the kind of the sort of commitment this game is. The grand campaign isn't for the faint-hearted, and there really is only so many kind of grand campaigns of Pride of Nations that you can fit in your life, and that's true of any strategy game, I suppose. But you sort of get the idea. And it's been a hell of a first 10 years for the Ottoman Empire. I mean, we start, the game in 1850 as a very backward power, a kind of power in a deep state of decay, of decline. And in the first 10 years, well, in the first 2 years, really, we quickly find ourselves at war with a very powerful nation, an old adversary, Russia, to the north. Now, in the two wars that we fought this decade, we came out on top. The first war against Russia, of course, we were part of a broad coalition, although we did most of the fighting, and we defeated Russia many, many times in the field, in the Balkan Peninsula, but it was probably fair to say fairly touch and go at the end. And the second war against Austria, which I imagine would be even more dicey, ended up being a wholesale defeat for Austria, and the most sensational outcome that we could have hoped for. Righting the historical wrong of failing to take Vienna twice before we took Vienna in the last decade. And during that time, despite the fact that we've spent nearly 4.5, 5 years of the last 10 years at war, we've undergone a profound period of industrialization and economic development. Our economy in 1850 was principally rooted in guild-based production and crafts production. Even most of our agricultural resources were produced by agricultural guilds. We have in the last 10 years created an economy, a new kind of economy that has completely eclipsed that early modern system of production. That system still exists in the background, but it's increasingly being kind of subsumed by a new kind of capitalist economy. We began our industrial revolution really with an agricultural revolution. If you cast your mind back, in the first 2 years, really, we focused on developing large agricultural enterprises, mostly in the Balkan Peninsula. The Balkan Peninsula, for us, is kind of our breadbasket. It's the area where we have most of our cereals, fruit production, also tobacco production, and many of our kind of fisheries are located in the Balkan Peninsula. It's fair to say that in Anatolia we also have a sizable kind of production of fish, but for the most part the agricultural sort of breadbasket of the agricultural heartland of the Ottoman Empire is the Balkan Peninsula. And we focused on developing RGOs, large agricultural enterprises, big plantations that are rooted on a kind of for-profit basis. And this succeeded in a couple of things. First of all, expanding our agricultural production significantly so that our population would have a wide sort of, or access to a wide range of foodstuffs, to ensure that we always exceeded domestic demand, so that we would have some kind of export commodities. And we have ultimately focused on tobacco as a kind of cash crop that we could export, that we have reasonable indigenous access to. Now, at the beginning of this period, we had no tobacco plantations at all, and we're now the second biggest tobacco exporter in the world after the United States. Even we've surpassed Spain, any Latin American country, many other countries that have access to tobacco, like the Dutch East Indies. We are the second biggest tobacco exporter. And tobacco exports really provided us with a constant trickle of liquidity that we needed to begin to build and develop an industrial base. In 1850, we didn't even have the capacity, the engineering or technological capacity to build modern, large-scale industrial factories. Some of them did exist in the Ottoman Empire, in very small number. We had a couple of factories in Constantinople, but they had obviously been developed in the previous period on a sort of largely experimental basis. But in order to develop a sort of systematic industrial base, required certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of technique, and engineering kind of understanding. And we've developed this, and we now, we have many, many factories. Most of our industrial revolution really has so far been focused on Constantinople, where we have now a number of factories, including a shipbuilding plant and this sort of thing. Also Smyrna, and increasingly of late Sinop. Sinop is emerging as the third industrial city of the empire. And then it was about 5-6 years in that we developed the technological capacity to build railroads. And we now have railroads that go as far west as Salonika and as far east as Erzurum, and we are in the process of constructing a line to Kars, which we intend to put a branch line down to Van. This enables us now to strategically redeploy forces from the European theatre, or the centre of power at Constantinople, to the frontier in the east in no time at all. So it has an important kind of military utility, but also these railroads in the east will allow us to exploit iron and coal, of course. As you can imagine, is these are the staple raw materials for a burgeoning industrial base during this period. The exploitation of coal reserves in Ankara, Zonguldak, and Smyrna have allowed us to be almost self-sufficient. Not quite, but we're kind of almost self-sufficient. And that's quite important, because one thing that I'm noticing on the international markets, and that is that coal is beginning to dry up. Access to coal abroad is becoming a more and more kind of fraught kind of question, and I don't know how long we're going to be able to import coal for. So the next step, of course, is, well, we've already begun the development of rail lines going through central Bulgaria, Sofia, up to Niš, and we developed a coal mine in Niš also, and we're going to begin to exploit this kind of coal mining region in southern Serbia and western Bulgaria. But our economy is completely transformed. Now, I would say that it has probably tripled in size in the last 10 years. It's absolutely phenomenal. Exports have begun to drop off ever so slightly, but that's intentional. It's because we're actually looking to stockpile manufactured goods. But if we look at domestic, our national market, domestic kind of consumption, just this term, then we sold 113 units of goods on the national market for 443 private capital. Now, if we compare that to April 1850 domestic market, sales were 51 units of goods for 194. Exports were 48 for 190. Exports this turn actually are about the same as what they were. In April 51, domestic market sales were 57 at 232. April 52, they were 65 at 279. If we jump forward then to 56, domestic market sales were 63 at 207, and last year domestic market sales were 109 units of goods for 386, and now 113 for 443. So we can really see the growth in our economy. Domestic market sales is sort of palpably different. One important thing also is that value of stock has been in steady decline. Now, initially, value of stock was almost nothing. It was 1,500. But very, very quickly, it began to climb. Value of stock by 56, for example, was at the top end of 5,000. It was sort of about 5,756. And I think at one point we reached about 6,000. Value of stock is beginning to decline now. The reason for that is because all the stockpile of kind of different goods that we had accumulated in our economy were beginning to shift. And that shows a kind of boom in the world market. Exports are up, and we have to artificially suppress exports now by making things unavailable in order to stockpile them to reduce what we make in exports. If we wanted, we could sell the 98 manufactured goods. We could sell half of those in the next fortnight, and we would struggle to replace what we sell. I've seen exports range in some cases up to 70 to 80 units of goods, and the most we've made in terms of value of exports have been around 400. Every fortnight, our economy turns over about 500 to 700 private capital, presumably 500 to 700,000, I don't know, pounds worth of wealth in a sort of a private capital, if you like, in a kind of private liquidity. The overheads of our economy are at about 244, so that's subtracted from that, if you like, each time. So we make a healthy profit, and it's really noticeable, especially in the last 2 years. Since about 58, you can actually see this. You can see this because of the amount of Railroad development. I mean, most of this railroad development has been put down in the last 6 months based on the amount of private capital we've got, based on the steel and the manufactured goods stockpile that we've had. We're just reproducing that into kind of plant and mostly focusing on railroads. And there's a huge amount of railroad development in the Balkan Peninsula now, which will increase our agricultural production, which is important because actually agricultural consumption in the economy is dramatically increasing. To the point that, very, very soon we won't have any for export, which would be a first, because we could export agricultural goods in 1850. So the economy is growing dramatically, really, really quickly. I think probably from here, the next focus is going to be to, excuse me, exploit the coal mining region, as mentioned, in kind of western Bulgaria, southern Serbia, stretch a line up to Sarajevo, probably exploit the coal mining region in Bihać. And then probably from there on, we're going to begin to focus on an additional batch of factories. We're going to look to focus on continuing to develop Sinop, but also Ankara. Ankara is a place that we've fortified. It's a rapidly growing city, but there are no industrial enterprises there. We have coal mines outside the city. Ankara is going to sort of be our Sheffield. The idea is for Ankara to be a focus for heavy industry. So once we've exploited the coal mining regions in the Balkan Peninsula and also the iron deposits on the eastern frontier, we're going to be looking to develop steel plants in Ankara. Steel, but also machine parts. Steel and machine parts. These are two things that in the last 2 or 3 years we have access to. We have the ability to build steel and machine plants. So machine plants are important for building, well, let's have a look, mechanical parts. And that's a really important thing for factories, especially kind of like larger, more modern factories. And as factories become bigger and more complex, mechanical parts is going to be a really important part of that. Mechanical parts is kind of a commodity that is specific to factories, really. It's only used in the process of production. So if we want to expand our economy, it's all very well importing machine parts, which we have been doing. In fact, we don't need to do that anymore. That's all very well, but what we want to be doing is exporting machine parts and be in a position to supply our own machine parts. Machine parts require steel, of course, as you can imagine. So building steel plants and mechanical parts factories is going to be on the order of the day. Once the rail line, the branch-off line to Van is complete, and once we have rail access that exploits the coal mining region of the Balkan Peninsula and then connects up Sarajevo. And we should be able to achieve that relatively quickly, I think. Within 2 years, we should have a rail line stretching from Sarajevo in the west to Van in the east. And the rail line, this rail line will cut through all of the most important economic parts of the Ottoman Empire. The colonial areas like sort of Baghdad, Damascus, in the next decade we will look to link these up as well, but they're not a priority. I think once we've got the rail lines down in the Balkan Peninsula, once we've got the coal mines developed in the Balkan Peninsula and the iron mine in Van, then we're going to focus, as I say, on a sort of second wave of factory building. But and that's the plan. The armed forces have, as I'm fond of saying, doubled in size since 1850. The Imperial Guard has quadrupled in size, and the Imperial fleet has increased, not substantially, but we've built 12 screw corvettes, principally light ships for the Navy. But the Ottoman Navy is in relatively good shape in 1850, actually. It's a relatively modern Navy. It's not especially small. It's within the sort of top 4 or 5 navies in the world, and as such, there's no great urgency to expand the Navy. And as I've mentioned before also, we're on the cusp of kind of maritime engineering breakthroughs, which we are aware of, and there's lots of rumours of a kind of revolution in shipbuilding design just sort of around the corner. So we want to hold off a little bit, I think, on kind of massively expanding the fleet. But we have taken some kind of measures. We, of course, very early on seized an opportunity to build a shipbuilding plant in Constantinople, and we've continuously sought to expand the naval base in Constantinople. We're going to do that further. It's currently a level 8. We're looking to expand it, I think, probably to a level 2, probably by the end of 1862. I think that'll be the plan. Now, you will notice, looking at the map, beyond events more broadly regarding this decade, there have been some events that have happened actually since August last year. Now, the Austrian Empire made peace with Piedmont Sardinia. It looked like a white peace. Either that or Piedmont Sardinia paid them off. Because Piedmont Sardinia retained their hold on Milan, which is pretty incredible when we consider that the Austrian Empire controlled all of northern Italy. It looks like the Austrians control the agricultural enterprises outside Alessandria. That's interesting. And also, the Austrian Empire has made peace with France. So there's that, and peace has broken out between France and Prussia. But Austria, fast on the heels of its making peace with France, declared war against the Papal States, has invaded and occupied the Papal States, and has also declared war on the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, or Naples, in southern Italy, and has also declared war on the Kingdom, or the Principality of Romania, and has occupied that in short order. This has all happened, really, in the last few months. And, yeah, this raises some sort of interesting questions. Now, Austria has been guaranteed by Prussia. I don't think declaring war on Austria is going to be on the cards for a whole number of reasons, not least because we don't have to fight the Austrian army and the Prussian army at the same time. Prussia has been at war, of course, this whole time with Sweden in an alliance with Russia. Not a formal open offensive alliance, but they have good relations and they're cooperating together. Now, Prussia guarantees Austria. Prussia also works with Russia and Scandinavia. The thing that I'm having a bit of a concern over here is the kind of two Kaisers and the Tsar working closely together. We don't like this. The three tin pot sort of sawdust Caesars fancy themselves as Roman emperors and working in increasingly sort of close collaboration. Now, we have good reason to declare war on Austria. They're throwing their weight around. They're a former opponent of ours, and absolutely we don't like what's going on. Well, first of all, they haven't left Montenegro. They're still technically at war with Montenegro, and by the looks of it have decided they're going to occupy Montenegro for the long haul. They've occupied Montenegro for a couple of years now, and now they've just occupied Romania, which is absolutely bewildering. And we don't know how long they're going to occupy Romania for, whether they have claims on Romanian territory or what the deal is. But we're not going to fall into the kind of trap that our forefathers did only a century ago. In the 18th century, the Ottomans always found themselves at war with more than one European power at the same time. And often they were able to hold their own, but sometimes they weren't. And, even if we weren't able to hold our own in the 18th century, these wars, they drained our resources, our economy, and our strength, and this kind of thing. And we don't want to do that. So we're not going to declare war on the Austrian Empire. Also, the strategic kind of balance has been really upset. The Svornik gap doesn't exist anymore. A war against Austria would be across a broad front where they have lots of options of entry into Ottoman territory. So to that end, we are going to have to conduct a further expansion of our army. It's not going to be a dramatic one, but we're going to add an additional field command that we're going to begin constructing. The field command is going to be given to Omar Pasha's number 2. He's a 3-star general, Ahmed Pasha, and its base is going to be in Salonika. So we'll have an army in Sofia under Hussein Avni Pasha, an army in Adrianople under Omar Pasha, an army in Ankara under Abdi Pasha, an army in Erzurum, Eastern Army, under Abdul Karim Nadir, and a 5th army will be based in Salonika under the command of Ahmed Pasha. This means that we will have a standing field command of about 500,000 men, which for any time period is a fairly sizable army, especially so for the 1860s. It means that we'll have 3 commands in the European theatre at any one time, plus a reserve that we can draw in from Ankara if need be. And it means that we can hold our own in the Balkan Peninsula whilst maintaining security on the Eastern Front. We can maintain a field command there long term. If something happens, Russia gets tied up somewhere else, and it looks inconceivable that Russia can move against us, the option always exists. Just strategically redeploy this force very rapidly to the European theatre. Within a month, we could move this force to the European theatre. It also means that in the event of a Russian declaration of war, we're well positioned to strategically redeploy forces back. But it means that if push comes to shove, we could commit 500,000 men to a war in the Balkan Peninsula. That's 5 times the size of the army that we had when we were fighting Russia in 1852, when we had one field command under the command of one Omar Pasha. It ended up under the command of Omar Pasha. Of course, it began under the command of Reza Pasha. So we would have availability of an army of up to 5 times that size. That's a significantly enlarged army. And of course, the 5th Army that will base at Salonika will also be based around an Imperial Guard corps. So the Imperial Guard will have expanded 5 times since 1850. That's fairly substantial. We have the economic base to support it, I would suggest now. It does require manufactured goods to maintain it also, but we have an army we have 4 field commands, and it's not making any serious dent in our economy. There's no sense that our administration is straining to maintain that force. And we have the manpower to do it. It will require us also to expand on the reserve in order to kind of prepare replacements in the event of significant engagements. But we have to draw conclusions from what the Austrians are doing. It's sort of rather looking like the idea of hobbling Austria may have become its opposite, which is to say that the prestige that Austria has lost, that they're perhaps looking to offset that by lashing out wildly, especially at minor powers. They're continuously indulging in kind of adventures. I mean, they currently occupy the Papal States. Do they intend to occupy that long term? We don't know. We don't know if they have claims on the Papal States. What's their plan with southern Italy? And more to the point, the area that really concerns us, of course, is Montenegro and Romania. This is our backyard. These 2 territories are former colonies of our empire. They are principalities. Okay, they are de facto independent principalities that don't necessarily hold us in the highest regard. But nevertheless, when these were made independent, they were made independent on the basis of peace arrangements in prior centuries against either Austria or Russia. And those peace arrangements were to create essentially buffer zones, semi-autonomous principalities, not for them to be occupied by Austria. So we don't like this, but we're not going to fall into the trap of finding ourselves at war with Austria and Prussia, which might very quickly spread to a war with Russia as well. So we draw conclusions, we keep a cool head, we make preparations, and we begin the construction of an additional field command. This decade, we plan to significantly restructure the Navy and enlarge it to the point that we will become the main maritime power of the Mediterranean. And the view is that by this time, next decade, by the beginning of January 1870, I want the Ottoman Empire to be the 2nd maritime power on Earth after Britain. Now, there's going to be a big drop-off from where Britain is at to where we're at, but the idea is we want to be a maritime challenge to countries like France and the United States, which is a regional power, but is a significant maritime power even at this time. That's the plan. And of course, these ships will be utilizing the most modern kinds of maritime engineering. Now, allowing us to build precision machine tools, which is an important technological development, in turn allows us to research the next qualitative military kind of leap, really, muzzle-loaded rifles. This will give us access pretty much to an entirely new force-pull infantry. This is like Ottoman kind of infantry soldier 1860. This is the next big change. And all of the transactions in our economy are generating a lot of tax revenue. It means that we can continuously now fairly comfortably fund this research program. I think probably any one time now we can continuously fund 1 or maybe 2 research programs. I'm going to hold off on the second one because I want to make sure that we have state revenue, for example, for colonization options, but also decrees and laws. We're going to look now to fairly consistently invest in education, probably on an annual basis, and that's about cost the state about $400 a year to do that. But this technology is going to be invested in by the state. It's not cheap. It's $50,000 per turn, and yeah, it's an inefficient way of kind of speeding up research. But this is an important strategic development, and it's something we've got to keep an eye on. Also, things like ironcladding wooden ships and maritime technologies are also kind of on our radar, probably once this is completed. So yeah, That's the next big thing, really, is the next big technology that we're kind of waiting for. In the last 10 years, colonially, we have turned Kuwait from an influenced territory into a protectorate. And in this decade, we plan to make this region a colony. We also, from absolutely nothing, achieved colonial penetration in the Persian Gulf and have converted this entire region into Ottoman protectorates, which means that they can only be taken from us in a war now. There's no other way that any other power can take these. They can't do it through their own colonial penetration. They can cause our own position to atrophy by investing themselves in sort of colonial projects here, which can stop us making these regions full colonies. But these regions are not far off. It's just getting us over the kind of threshold. The Hejaz was a protectorate to begin with in 1850. It remains a protectorate, albeit one with a substantially larger sort of colonial presence now. Colonial penetration in the Hejaz is much deeper. We've got a lot of important things like colonial fortresses, missions, this kind of thing. These will have the effect of gradually suppressing the revolt risk in this region, but that will be a long-term prospect for sure. But the Hejaz looks actually much more stable than it did, excuse me, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, Libya, Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, this region was just a mere protectorate. Very early on, we sought to convert this region into full colonial status, and that's really paid dividends because this is a region that we don't have contiguous land access to. Now, Egypt is a de jure territory of the Ottoman Empire during this period, but it is de facto independent. It's sort of analogous, I suppose, to kind of, I guess, Ireland for Britain after the First World War, between the end of the First World War and kind of 1946, when Ireland becomes formally a republic. Ireland is really only a dominion of the United Kingdom during that period, but it is de facto independent. It calls its own shots. It doesn't get involved in wars to support Britain or anything like that. That's very similar kind of situation with Egypt. We had a real upset with Egypt, our former colony. It had been a colony since the excuse me, early 16th century, when Salim I completely destroyed the Mamluks and made it an Ottoman territory. But in the 1820s, we had a real upset under Muhammad Ali. Local kind of bey launched an invasion of the Middle East and did very well indeed, and even looked at one point like he could be threatening Constantinople. This was in the midst of our army reforms. This kind of campaign went on to the 1830s, 1840s, but it ultimately resulted in the great powers intervening and the Egyptians being forced to kind of accept that they were an Ottoman province. But you know, the reality is, of course, they are de facto independent. There's not much we can do about that, really. And yeah, it's a shame. I mean, like Egypt is quite a resource-rich region, especially for cotton and cereals and this kind of thing. But there's not much we can do about that. But because we don't have contiguous land access to Libya, getting this into kind of colonial status, formal colonial status early on was absolutely key. I think it's paid for itself many times over. So, and the other thing, of course, the other two things is, one, the ongoing attempt, which has been happening throughout 10 years, to get a kind of, not a colonial toehold in Yemen. We kind of have that now, really, but to subjugate this region. This is by far the most violent region, the area that sort of resists our colonial presence the most. And we've had some real upsets. I mean, even actually since August last year, Sana'a at one point briefly fell to Yemeni insurgents. You can see that we're reconstructing military outposts. Colonial, we're sending merchants with a view to developing, in fact, we can do that right away, developing a trade post. And yeah, again, it was costly. It didn't cost us too much in terms of prestige. It cost us a little bit. National morale remains well above 100% because, of course, we're only sort of years after having sort of sacked Vienna. So the regime, the kind of the imperial government rests on a high watermark of kind of popular support. But the Yemen continues to be a thorn on our side. We've established ourselves well in Aden. And for the most part, the situation is more stable in the western part of the territory. Although, of course, we can see Yemeni forces in Hodeida at the moment. What they tend to do when they're quite small now is they break off. It's actually quite hard to engage them in a kind of toe-to-toe fight. They tend to break off and we chase them around the country. But the truth is, in order to really consolidate this region, we have to keep forces in the same territory for a period of time. It's probably going to involve us sending more smaller detachments, probably Marines, maybe some cavalry, or mixed kind of brigades, in order to really hold territory. And we need forces on territory in order to implement a lot of the colonial moves we want to implement, like prosecuting military expeditions, pacifying expeditions, and things like this. It requires us to have military units in place to actually do that. But it's this is a kind of lucrative enough prospect that it's worth persevering with, and we will do that. The other kind of most recent area of interest for us, of course, is the island of Sumatra. We really have a dominant commercial position in Sumatra now. We've made landing with a small expeditionary force. It's fast running out of supplies, and we're looking to conduct a military expedition. But really, the purpose of this is to try and acquire some kind of level of military control over the western part of the island, which we're struggling with at the moment, in order to start building infrastructure there. What's really interesting is with our unit here, we can get a bit of an insight into the indigenous forces here, and there's something that I just absolutely have to show you. So you've got the native regulars, their kind of uniform, which is absolutely superb, but the really very cool thing here are the fortress guns in Asia, and they are absolutely wonderful. Early modern kind of guns, it's superb. But yeah, we've got a Marine brigade with now a fast emptying supply train in Asia. It's not a large enough force for us to really get military control, because we weren't aware of the presence of kind of a local sultanate, really, the military force of a local sultanate, which holds this really in their control. Now, they are neutral, they don't, for now anyway. There's a good chance that the longer our force stays in this territory, the more problematic relations will become with the Sultanate of Asia. But yeah, it may be the case that we'll move this Marine brigade possibly to Siak or Jambi or something like this, and maybe try and develop a base somewhere else. We need to try and find a location on this island where the indigenous kind of polity doesn't have any kind of muscle in place. Otherwise, we're going to be engaging in a really, really serious fight. We could do that, but I just don't think we're in a position to do it yet. I think we'll probably have to consolidate Aden first of all. But we can use our military or our colonial penetration in Sumatra at the very least, excuse me, to stop it going over to the Dutch. And I think that's the key thing for the time being. Our trade posts, pay for themselves. So I think we just kind of maintain our position. And there's not much more we can do here other than to try and... The main thing is the colonial capital of Palembang, drive up a colonial penetration as much as possible. And then just keep an eye on developments here. But that's it. First decade in a bag. And yeah, kind of went quite quick. And I'll be honest with you, if I'd been playing this without making kind of YouTube, like a YouTube diary of the campaign, it would... I would have probably played about the same number of turns in the same period, to tell you the truth. So I would probably be in January 1860 around now anyway. So it's, again, that gives you an idea as to how much of a commitment the game is. But yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted. I think between now, really, and March, we're going to begin the construction of the 5th Field Command, probably in Smyrna or Sinop. It doesn't matter now. With railroads, we can redeploy it to Salonika from sort of wherever. But we're going to begin that. And yeah, really begin to focus on kind of exploiting the coal mining area now of the Balkan Peninsula. So that's it. What's the 1860s going to bring us, I wonder? I mean, I'd rather not have to kind of fight 2 really large wars again. But if it happens, it happens. I think the main thing with the Ottoman Empire is the wars will come to us, sort of thing. We've established ourselves as the 5th ranked power. Austria 7th, and I suspect that's why they're lashing out. Austria, far from being cowed by this kind of the move that we made to kind of devastate them economically, they're like a kind of wounded animal now. It's just lashing out, and we've kind of switched places, really. Austria is now the sick man of Europe, unpredictable, violent, attacking kind of minor principalities, and in a weird way, if we sit back, they may end up hanging themselves with this rope, because I don't know how long other European powers are going to sit back and let Austria sort of, act like an absolute tyranny. I don't know what. I mean, the French have just made peace with Austria, but I don't know, how this is going to go down in Paris. That Austria's decided to make crazy moves in the Italian peninsula. So we'll sit back for now, but prepare ourselves for war. Yeah, that's it, really. Economically, the railroad in Van, the iron mine there, and then we've got the railroads being laid already. I'm going right up now into Constanta. We are going to begin developing war plans in the next year or two. I've been promising this, but I think we do need to give some careful thought, especially to what we do in the event of a war with Austria now. What if Austria declares war on us? You know, it would be a completely different sort of war to the one that we fought before. There'll be no kind of securing the Zvornik Gap. They already have a position in Montenegro. They could fly through Romania. They could cross, anywhere really. And we would initially have to fight a defensive campaign. Furthermore, we wouldn't legally be able to cross into Romania. We could defeat the Austrian army there and liberate the region, but we'd have to fall back because we don't have transit rights with Romania. And Romania won't necessarily give us those transit rights, amazingly. So we could declare war on Romania in the event of a war with Austria. That's another option. And Montenegro. That means that we can occupy this region for ourselves and prosecute a campaign through Romania and into Transylvania in the event that we engage Austrian forces there. So that's an option. But we need to develop kind of concrete plans, give some careful thought to what we do in the event of a war against Austria or indeed a war against Russia. Now, we have begun to kind of make some careful kind of provisions really for a war against Austria. The eastern frontier is firmed up and is now, for the most part, connected by railroad. We've got a fortress in Batumi. The fortress in Kars has been expanded and modernized, and we've got a fortress in Van to the south. So the whole frontier is now calcified. This makes it hard for the Russians to kind of penetrate deep into eastern Anatolia with small cavalry formations and things like this. We now have forces that can hold them and allow for our main field command to react from Erzurum. There's a reason we're keeping Al-Karim back from the frontier, because I think Kars is going to be in a position to hold out against any kind of big attack. And what we would like is for a Russian force maybe to move into Kars, press an attack against Kars, then we respond and move in against the Russian force that's possibly kind of worse for wear, having attempted to storm the fortress. That's one option. But anyway, we'll give some sort of more careful thought to war plans against Russia and Austria, because who knows, maybe the 1860s goes like the 1850s. Maybe we wind up at war with Austria and Russia again. Maybe we don't. Maybe we spend 10 years peacefully developing. And if that's the case, that's the case. And in some senses, it would be welcome. The Ottoman Empire has managed to develop a lot in the last 10 years. We've managed to make up a lot of lost ground economically, and the Industrial Revolution now is well underway in the Ottoman Empire. And I would propose that we've industrialized to a much greater extent than they did in real life during the same period. And we've very much established ourselves on the map as a great power. We're now the 5th ranked power. Russia is above us. And who is 6th? Let's have a look. Britain 1, France 2, Prussia 9, Austria 7. Austria's score is 5-3-1-0. Yeah, here we go. China. And we would probably gain more prestige than China. We would be looking to. Oh no, well they're already below us. They're the we're the 5th. They're the 6th power. So yeah, there's a bit of a drop off from Russia to us though. Russia is 10,000 and climbing rapidly, but Russia is set to eclipse. I guess the United States is the 3rd power with 11,000. The United States, of course, would have been probably competing with us for 4th place. They were much closer to where we are now, but they had this kind of big diplomatic victory over the Hawaii Islands, this crisis with Britain, which has kind of propelled them in a rather temporary fashion, possibly, into kind of 3rd power status, which is quite a surprise. But it may not be temporary. Maybe they hold that position. In the last analysis, the United States is only going to get more powerful from this period onwards. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. What does this decade bring us? I guess that remains to be seen. But it's it's going to be an interesting one. And we'll just carry on, as we have the last 10 years, economically developing the Ottoman Empire. Looking for kind of lucrative commodities that we can export, expanding our domestic market, and also expanding the armed forces. in such a way to ensure that we face the security threats that face us in the next decade. And I would propose we are much, much better placed this decade to face any kind of security threats that come our way. I feel that any war that we find ourselves in is going to be an easier affair than the first war, at least, that we found ourselves in the 1850s. And also, to embrace and exploit any technologies that we can to give us a military edge and to kind of mitigate and offset the technological backwardness that we have. And also begin to also increasingly look at like laws and decrees to ensure that as we industrialize and develop, we kind of have control over the hearts and minds of our subjects. So the other thing we could look at is to be a kind of progressive kind of tyranny. To look at things like increasing social protection. That requires a lot of state revenue, but also private capital, because of course it comes out of the pockets of capitalists to ensure that workers are paid a good wage, that children don't work, and things like that. So that's going to be an option for this decade as well, to begin to look at kind of improving the conditions of our workers as we industrialize. And we have to kind of temper that and be a little bit careful, because the priority is that we lay plant, that we get the productive forces in place, and then we get kind of key strategic industries exploiting raw materials. But once that's established, we need to start looking at the other thing, demographics. We need to start looking at militancy, revolt risk, and also things like literacy. Literacy is going to be really, really important, especially in the major cities, the big industrial cities. We want to start developing a burgeoning kind of middle class of clerks, of educated people, that in turn will begin to have an impact on things like our Academy of Sciences. Now, that's much less a mechanical thing than it is in other kinds of games compared, for example, good comparisons like the Victoria games and stuff like that are much more mechanical. You just increase money in education and this immediately translates. That's much less the case in this kind of game. Like, it takes a much longer time, and it's subject to a whole host of factors, how urbanized you are, but also just certain kind of characteristics about your society that aren't really going to change very much. We could, sure enough, achieve a kind of technological parity with most other powers in terms of military hardware. We could absolutely do that, and actually that's something the Ottomans kind of did anyway. By the First World War, you wouldn't have said that militarily they were technologically massively backward compared to most other European powers. The Ottomans fielded an air force in the First World War and a fairly effective army, as it turned out. But they were able to do that through strategically investing in certain kinds of technologies and obviously embracing help from countries like Germany and great power patrons. We're probably going to be less reliant on great power patrons than the Ottoman Empire really was. But we'll see what the 1860s bring us in here. But certainly laws and decrees and beginning to have more of an eye on long-termism, because we couldn't really afford to do that in 1850. We had to focus on getting the plant down, exploiting raw materials, re-gearing our economy really to a kind of capitalist economy, almost rerouting the economy in a different kind of logic. That logic has now taken hold and it's propelling our economic development. But I think I'll leave it there. The next video, I guess, will be kind of maybe March, April time this year. And welcome to the 1860s. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.